Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to Duke. I have a special fondness, actually, for Duke, and so it's always a great pleasure to come here and a great pleasure to visit the labs. So what I want to talk about today in a very general way are issues at the interface of the empirical sciences and how we think about responsibility. How it is that we feel entitled to hold people responsible for certain kinds of actions that they perform. So because this is a very general audience and because I want to talk, because I want to really sketch a very broad panoramic view of the landscape, there will be times when I can give you some detail and there will be times when I will just have to advert to the detail that exists. But in 50 minutes, there's not only so much I can say, so I kind of want to apologize in advance that some of the detail that I would like to include, I won't be able to do it. Now, I think of free will as involving three kinds of problems which are sort of distinct. The first one is sometimes thought of as metaphysical, where the question is, are we free from physical causes when we choose? I'll talk a little bit about that one first. The second one is the one that in a way is fundamentally, I think, more interesting, and it's the practical social question of when we should attribute responsibility and credit to others. And finally, there's the moral psychological question, what are our capacities to change ourselves and can we cultivate virtues and habits? I'll have a little bit to say about the last one, but most of what I have to say will be about the first two. Now, to frame the things that I want to say about the metaphysical question, I first want to remind you about some very recent research by Caspi and Moffat. And I discovered today that Caspi and Moffat are now at Duke, I think as of January, and are in the psychology department. So this is a very special delight to know that. In 2002, Caspi and Moffat published the results of a long study. And in that study, they had tracked a fairly large number, hundreds of infants from the time they were born until they were adults. And the question that they were interested in was motivated by an observation made by many parents and teachers, and that was that there seemed to be a subset of children, primarily males, and that subset had a tendency to be very dysfunctionally aggressive. Sort of unprovoked and self-destructive hostility tended to be the pattern. And their question was, is there really such a subpopulation? And is there something biological about this population that might explain this behavior? A longitudinal study requires enormous dedication, and the results came out many years later, and at a time when it was also possible to do genetic analysis. Now, very, very briefly, what they discovered was that there was indeed a subpopulation of children who behaved in this very self-destructive, antisocial way. Moreover, they discovered that if you looked at the genes of those children, you discovered that they had a genetic variant in a promoter region for the production of an enzyme called monoamine oxidase A. But it turned out to be slightly more interesting than just that there was a gene-behavior relationship, because not all of the children who had the MAOA variant showed the behavior. So what was the factor? And what they discovered was that not only was it important to carry the gene, but in addition there had to be a behavioral factor, namely child abuse. So if the children both carried the MAOA promoter variant and they were abused, then there was an extremely high probability that they showed the behavior. And in this particular graph, what you can see is that the individuals who have low monoamine oxidase A, you'll see on the vertical axis is the index for antisocial behavior. The horizontal axis shows degree of child maltreatment, and the degree of antisocial behavior in the MA-OA polymorphisms goes way, way up as a function of the environmental conditions. This was, I think, one of the most extraordinary discoveries relating in the human genes, brain, and behavior. Now, it didn't tell us why the antisocial behavior occurred. But of course, there were some tantalizing possibilities. One is that monoamine oxidase A is an enzyme that breaks down neurotransmitter, specifically serotonin, but also norepinephrine. And so one suggestion was that if you have low amounts of monoamine oxidase A, you have increased amounts of norepinephrine, and you have stress from abuse, then you're going to change the whole stress system. So that was kind of the framing story, in a way, that I wanted to begin with. And now I want to go back and address some of the metaphysical questions, or questions that people think of as metaphysical, regarding the nature of choice, decision-making, and free will. Probably brains are causal machines. Everything we know so far suggests that they're causal machines in the sense that they go from state to state as a result of antecedent states. And one question that this seems to raise for many people is, what does this really signify for what we think of as free will, especially in the social context, free choice, and responsibility? Now, there is a sort of common sense story about free will, according to which we go through a kind of apparent sequence when we make a decision. We consider, we choose, we form an intention, and we act. And most of us think, or at least until fairly recently, most of us tend to think that this process of going through these steps is something of which we are consciously aware. And part of what I want to do in the discussion of some of the psychological experiments is to cast doubt on this common sense story of free will. A philosophical idea, which I think really does not emerge until Descartes, is that in order for a choice to be genuinely free, that is, in order for you to hold me responsible, it must be the case that that choice is not caused by antecedent factors. It must be the case that that choice is in some sense created by me, or perhaps you might say created by reason. And that I can feel introspectively when it is that I create my choices and when my actions are caused by external factors. I mentioned that I think that this begins with Descartes, partly to contrast it with Aristotle, where we see a very thoughtful and considered distinction between voluntary behavior and involuntary behavior in the context of Aristotle's discussing under what conditions should we punish people for their behavior. Aristotle does never suggest that in order for us to legitimately punish people for their bad behavior, that their choices must be uncaused. So I want to consider a little bit this question of whether or not our decisions and choices must be uncaused in this Cartesian sense in order to be considered free. And this has been, of course, bandied about since Descartes, this issue. And I tend to think that David Hume had really the best answer in the 18th century, and if there's anything in philosophy that counts as a result, I think this is one of them. Descartes pointed out that it must be the case that decisions are caused because they need to be caused by the antecedent beliefs and desires and motivations and hopes and fears and so forth that we have. And his point was something like this, that if I perform an action as a result of a choice, and that action is not got any antecedent factors such as beliefs and desires and so forth. If, for example, without really intending or believing that you want to hear this, I suddenly begin to sing the Canadian national anthem. I didn't really want to do it. I didn't think you would want to hear it. I just haul off and do it. Hume thought, and I think this is sort of deeply correct as a, if you like, a metaphysical point, that such an action would be random, out of the blue, and would not in fact count as an action for which you would hold me responsible. And so Hume's point was that they're all caused, both those actions for which we want to hold people responsible and those that we don't. And what we should be interested in is what the differences are in the brain between those actions that are caused and we call them voluntary, and those actions which are caused and we call them not voluntary. All right. The other point that I think is worth mentioning here goes like this. Again, this is really just to remind ourselves that unpredictable does not imply not cause. There are many events that are unpredictable. If it's a windy day and I go up on the roof and I take a $5 bill and I let it go, its precise trajectory in the wind as it gets knocked around and flies about is really not predictable, not given the computational power that I have to compute its trajectory millisecond by millisecond. So its trajectory is unpredictable, but nobody is going to say that it's uncaused. On the other hand, the way physicists use the expression undetermined, what they have in mind really is that there is no determinable antecedent cause. And although it is still moot in physics whether there are any such events, as I'm sure you know, there are some people who think that quantum mechanics requires that there are events at the subatomic level that are undetermined in this sense. However, at the level of the network or even the neuron in the brain, so far as we know, events are caused. Or if there happens to be a certain amount of randomness, there's no reason to think that it would find its way to just the right place so that my choices would end up being uncaused. The other thing that I think is relevant in thinking about unpredictability here, because sometimes we think, well, you know, if the brain is a causal machine, then everything that I do is completely predictable. It's worth reminding ourselves that in the human brain there's roughly 10 to the 11 neurons. There's roughly 10 to the 15 synapses. The bandwidth is about 10 to the 15 bits per second, which is roughly the bandwidth of Google worldwide. That's a lot for one brain. And memory is about 10 to the 16 bits over a lifetime. Now, these are rough numbers, and if they're out by an order of magnitude one way or another, I think the point still holds. So much of this sort of millisecond by millisecond or second by second aspects of human behavior may not be predictable. But of course, many aspects of human behavior are, in their very general way, quite predictable. If I'm in an undergraduate class and I say to them, tell me the first vegetable that comes to your mind, about 85% of them will say carrot. It's just a fact, right? I bet, well, I won't ask. I'm pretty sure that if I get on a plane and I gratuitously insult the passenger next to me, that he will be cross. I don't know in precise detail what form that will take, but it's a reasonable bet, and so forth. So I also can predict with great reliability that most people in this room at some time before 1 a.m. will fall asleep. All right. And I want now to tell you another sort of neurological story, because I think this one is also important as we try to put this issue of causation versus non-causation in context. This is a rather alarming an anatomical slide showing a very large tumor in the brain of this person. This is from the side view, this is from the back view, this is from the top view. This was a very normal man who was married for the second time. He lived quite happily with his wife. He had no previous history of any problems. One day the wife comes home and the 8-year-old stepdaughter explains to her that the husband had molested her. Police are called, he's hauled away, he's given the option of going to jail or going into a 12-step program. He goes into a 12-step program. He does not do well. As time goes by, his behavior becomes increasingly troubled. He pinches nurses' bottoms, he makes lewd remarks, he's generally unacceptable. And so it is determined that he needs to spend time in jail. The night before he is to go to jail, he complains of very severe headaches. This is thought to be malingering. But nevertheless, the neurologist takes a look and notices, amongst other things, that he has an abnormal gait. And so they do a few brief neurological tests, and it's clear that there is something very wrong with this man. A scan is done, and this is what is seen. A very large tumor invading frontal structures, presumably also the septum and the hypothalamus, which are regions known to have a role, we don't know in detail what it is, but some role in sexual behavior. So the tumor is removed. What happens is his behavior returns to normal. He has absolutely no interest in child pornography, although he had during the earlier phase of the molestation. He has no interest in child sex. He's simply interested in his wife. Life goes on much as before. After about 6 months, he reports to his doctor that, to his great annoyance, this interest has reemerged. He's rescanned, and amazingly enough, the tumor, which was not completely cleaned out, has begun to regrow. So it was once again removed, and his sexual impulses went back to normal. Now, I find this case is interesting for all of the obvious reasons, but I think it's also very interesting because if you really thought that choices had to be uncaused to be free, in this sort of case, you'd have to say the tumor got in there and made his choices unfree because they caused it. But once you take the tumor out, suddenly causation vanishes. And that just seems very, very implausible. Given what we know about the role of sex hormones and sexual interests and so forth, it looks like it's causal all the way down. You might think, as you reach puberty and begin to have these thoughts about the boys on the other side of the room, that these thoughts come from your own free mind. But of course, they have a lot to do with how the hormones are interacting with certain parts of the brain. All right. So what else might we say with regard to this metaphysical question? And I think one of the interesting results, again, it's always only a small piece of the puzzle, but I think an important piece of the puzzle was put together by a neuroscientist called Ben Libet. And here's what Libet wanted to do. He had subjects with EEG electrodes on their heads. And he said, here's all you need to do. You need to sit at the table, and when you feel an urge to press the button, I want you to look at this great big clock and tell me where, and make a note in your mind of where the second hand is. Feel the urge and press the button. That's all you have to do. And then at the end, tell me where the second hand was. So the activity of the brain is being recorded by the EEG electrodes. And basically what you see is that, don't worry too much about the lower part, is that you feel the urge to move now, and about 200 milliseconds later, the movement occurs because it takes time for nerve conduction and so forth. The interesting part is what happens here. So just look for the moment at the red one. So he feels the urge here, but the frontal electrodes begin to record increasing activity as much as 1,500 milliseconds prior to his awareness of the urge to move. Now, there's many ways that this might be interpreted, and it's not definitive of anything. But what it has suggested to a lot of people, including me, is that antecedent to the awareness of the intention, where if I were Descartes, I might say I create the intention, the brain is actually busily doing the motor preparation. And it may very well be the case that the intention is not so much created at this moment as that part of the brain is receiving a message from the motor preparation system saying, we're going. The decision has already been made. You feel it as being created by you, but in fact, it's already been made. Now, I also want to suggest that not only is causation everywhere and part of the story, but that also much of what we do, and much of it, what we do that's important, is done at the non-conscious level. And so I want to tell you about an experiment done by a Dutch psychologist called Ab Dijksterhuis. He did the following. He made up sketches of 5 different apartments. And they differed along 12 different dimensions: proximity to work, cost, space, whether they have a laundry, and so on and so forth. And there was, in fact, if you take normal human desires into account, there is one best apartment that maximizes the features that most people want. Now, we take a whole lot of subjects and we divide them into 3. One group of subjects reads through all of the descriptions and immediately makes a choice. One group of subjects works on the problem for 10 minutes. And, well, you know, it could be this, but they focus on the problem. The other group of subjects reads through all 5 and then is given a job to do, a puzzle where they have to really pay attention and unscramble words and do all kinds of things. And at the end, we look and see who actually does the best. In this condition, those who choose immediately don't do terribly well. The people who do best are the people who don't think about it. The people in the distraction condition do much better than the people who focus on the problem intently. Now, that is the result that you get so long as the problem is quite complex. And you can do it with apartments, you can do it with cars, and all kinds of things. If you simplify the problem so that you've only got, say, 2 apartments, and they differ only along 3 dimensions, then the conscious thinking guys actually tend to do the best. But it's very interesting that the problem is best solved by the really rather, let's imagine, huge resources of the non-conscious brain as opposed to the narrow bandwidth resources of the conscious brain. Along those lines, I want to give you another example from psychology that I think sort of provides perspective for the idea that not only are our decisions caused, but often they're caused in ways that are rather surprising. In this particular example, this was done by Lars Hall in Sweden. What he did was the following. He had male subjects and he had a pile of pictures of females. And he would show them 2 pictures and ask them to choose. And then he would put them face down, and then he would give them the one they chose. He's also a bit of a magician. So occasionally, like about 1 out of 5, they would choose, they would go down, he would give them the one they didn't choose. They only notice about 10% of the time. Mostly, they never notice. It's called choice blindness now. But not only do they not notice, I mean, I don't think this is a weird thing. I think probably this happens to us a lot. Not only did they not notice, but if Lars gives the student the unchosen one and says, well, why did you choose her? He said, oh, well, I really like those eyes, And that hairstyle has always been my favorite. So after the fact, in other words, a rationale is provided for the choice. How much of our choices fall into that class? One wonders. All right. And now I want to say just a little bit about some work that's also done here at Duke by Tanya Churchland. I got interested in this work because it related to some other ideas that I had about evolutionary biology, which we might be able to talk about later. But I wanted to know if there was such a thing as unconscious imitation. And I discovered Tanya and her colleagues in their work, and boy, is there unconscious imitation or unconscious mimicry. Here's the way they studied it. Undergraduate subjects and an experimental helper, which we'll call the confederate. They go into a room ostensibly to work on a task. The confederate is told to do one of two things. Either to imitate the body posture and some of the gestures, that sort of thing, of the student, or to do no imitation whatever. At the end, the undergraduate comes out and is interviewed about whether they liked the coworker. The results are extraordinary. If the confederate engages in lots of unconscious mimicry, the undergraduate comes out and says, oh yeah, I mean, we were kind of like really in sync. I really like that guy. Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to work with him again. If there was no mimicry, what happens is the student comes out and says, well, it went okay. No, I'd prefer not to work with him. Actually, I thought he was kind of creepy. Very interesting. Moreover, it turns out that if you socially stress the undergraduate before they come into the room to engage together on this irrelevant but ostensibly important project, socially stress them by making them feel slightly isolated from the group, then when they come in, their level of mimicry of the confederate goes way up. And it goes way up especially if the confederate is high-ranking relative to. So if the confederate is wearing a tie and sitting in the professor's chair, then the student's mimicry of the confederate really goes up. It's also important whether or not the student feels they are part of the group from which they feel isolated. If they do feel part of the group, they show increased mimicry of the confederate. If they don't, they don't. So it's not just kind of a reflex. So what's the important part of the story here? It's partly that there's a lot more that's unconscious than we thought that goes into what we think of as rational decision making, and that so far as the metaphysical question is concerned, it's all caused. It's all caused. But that doesn't mean we can't distinguish between kinds of causes, as Aristotle and as Hume rightly recognized. So I want to turn now to saying a little bit about the practical social questions, about when we should attribute responsibility to others. I find it most useful in thinking about this to think about it and this may or may not be a good way to do it, to think about it within a very broad context of evolutionary biology and the fact that we are very social animals. And so I want to say a little bit about evolutionary biology and the sociability of animals, and then I want to say something about what it is in our brains that contributes to social bonding. In the last century, a tremendous amount of work was undertaken in order to explain social behavior of the many, many species of social animals that exist. And models were developed to show that under certain conditions, a gene whereby there would be behavior for sociability, gathering together, sharing, cooperating, and so on, might spread through a population. And I'm just going to be very brief about this, but to our first approximation, the story said that under certain conditions, these social traits or social dispositions, as I prefer to think of them, will spread. First of all, the individuals need to be able to detect and remember non-cooperators. They need to be able to detect deception when you seem to be cooperating or working together but aren't. You also need to be able to shun and to punish non-cooperators. And that turned out to be extremely important. And I think that's not unrelated to the fact that humans typically, whether in very small primitive groups or very large groups, have a system for punishing non-cooperators. As Aristotle rightly observed, we are intensely social creatures. And for us, trustworthiness turns out to be a value. Social isolation is a cost. We know that the lone wolf packs it in pretty quickly because all it can do is scrounge for mice. It can't partake of the caribou that the pack can bring down. Lone baboons, lone chimpanzees do not do well. Their life is shorter. So social isolation is a cost, and it turns out untrustworthiness is a cost. But all of that is in the context of models, and it's really just to remind ourselves that there must be an evolutionary story that will explain how it is and why it is that we have the basic social dispositions that we do. What I really wanted to know is, what is it in the brain that makes us social? And it seemed like it was the kind of question that probably would never be answered in my lifetime, but this turned out to be quite wrong. So a number of years ago, it was noticed, well, actually, I suppose it's long been noticed by naturalists, that amongst a variety of species, there are some where individuals bond for very, very long periods of life, monogamous pair bonders. But in particular, it was discovered that there are two kinds of voles which are very, very similar. And you can see the little guys here. These guys are prairie voles, montane voles. They look very much alike. They're both rodents. Sorry. They differ very strikingly in behavior. So the prairie voles are monogamous pair bonders, and they are biparental. Both parents partake of a somewhat lengthy, for rodents, a somewhat lengthy childhood. The montane voles are promiscuous bonders. It's a one-off, and the male takes no part in the rearing of the pups. And actually, the female sort of kicks the pups out at a fairly young age as well. So Tom Insel and a variety of other people, Sue Carter, Larry Young, were very interested in whether we might ask a question of what's different about the brains of these two animals. And it turns out, surprisingly perhaps, that there are very specific differences in the brains. All right, so we have the montane voles on this side and the prairie voles here. And these are the females and these are the males. So I want to talk about the males first. So the difference that we see in the brains between montane voles and the prairie voles can be shown in the region called the ventral pallidum, part of the basal ganglia, where in the prairie vole, what is there? There is a very high density of receptors for a very specific peptide, namely vasopressin. These guys have lots of vasopressin. They just don't have very many receptors right there. So maybe that's the thing. And it turns out if you want to test that by blocking those receptors, then you can turn, so you put in a blocker so those receptors will no longer bind to vasopressin. Then it turns out that you can transform a monogamous pair bonder into a promiscuous pair bonder. And you can go the other way, although not with this, but with mice. Amazing. So what about in the case of the females? Well, the female prairie voles have a very high density in the nucleus accumbens for, again, a very simple and related peptide, oxytocin. And similarly, if you block oxytocin in the female, you change the behavior. And the thing about the prairie voles, if you watch their behavior in the lab, is they really like to hang out together. And the other thing is that the male will mate guard. So if other males try to approach that female, he gets very aggressive and beats them up, beats them off. And you don't see anything comparable to that in the case of the prairie voles. I mean, in the case of the montane voles. Now, there must, of course, be a genetic story behind all this, and so they went looking. The genetic story turns out to be somewhat more complicated than it at first appeared, but I'll give you the kind of simple version first. So there is, now we're talking about males and we're talking about vasopressin. So there is a gene that can be expressed that will produce vasopressin. And there is a region, a promoter region, which in the montane voles is fairly small, and in the prairie voles is quite large. And it looks like, although it's not exactly a switch, it looks like the size of the microsatellite region, the promoter, is going to affect the expression of the gene, which gives you the numbers of vasopressin receptors. And so you can fiddle with the genes and you can get certain really rather surprising effects. Now, part of the reason I thought this story was important when I first heard about it is that I think, notwithstanding the fact that we know that many species, like Canada geese, for example, are monogamous, I think we thought of that as a kind of deep moral human rule that arises out of reason. It's just the reasonable thing to do, to have a mate and stick with it. And it probably isn't like that at all. We don't know that much about the role of vasopressin and oxytocin in the human population, and that, of course, is what we would very much like to know. There certainly are, according to Sue Carter, a large number of people who do bond socially for very long periods of time and do show certain things that are behaviorally quite similar to the prairie voles. But of course, there is lots and lots of variation, biology being what it is. The other thing about the oxytocin story that turned out to be important was kind of investigated from a different angle, and that was the role of oxytocin in the offspring. So in early studies with monkeys and with rats, if you take the rat pup away, give it plenty of nutrition so it's normal and healthy in that respect, but it does not get the normal licking from the mother, then a number of things are very different behaviorally about that rat as it grows up. It's socially quite atypical, for one thing. But more than that, when you do the histology, it turns out there are lower levels of nerve growth factor. There are lower levels of oxytocin receptors. This, needless to say, has spawned the question about whether or not isolation of infants from loving and nurturing caregivers in humans has the result that there are changes in gene expression which involve changes in the wiring of the brain. And so people like Sue Carter and others are looking at that question. It also, I think, was an important story, or is an important story, because Darwin made the observation, as others have later, and actually Aristotle did too, that it may be that the affinity and fellow feeling that we have for non-kin really has its roots in the family, where it's all biologically mediated. So that there is this very special bond between parent and offspring, or in the case of prairie voles, between both parents. And some of that may also extend to members of the extended family. And so it does raise the question of whether or not certain aspects of behavior might also involve oxytocin social bonding to the wider group. So is it perhaps the case that as the ancestral groups got larger and larger and admitted more and more members, the better to beat up the neighboring group, Is it possible that oxytocin and oxytocin binding, perhaps through things like ritual and drumming and music and so forth, played a role? And I'm inclined to think that that's a speculation worth looking at closely. So it does look as though there is an important relation between gene expression and learning, and also that given certain kinds of cultural conditions, certain kinds of genes are more likely to be selected for than others. That is, certain kinds of individuals will do well in certain cultural circumstances and will do better than others. So roughly, I really want to say then that there is a story to be told about brain-based values, including social values, and that evolution sets the brain's basic style of drives and emotions, and that experience in a social setting shapes those styles into very specific habits using the resources of the reward system. So, back then to the question that motivated us having a look at the wider issue of what makes us social animals and what do we do about pathology? Is anyone ever responsible for anything? If Hume is right, then if all of our choices are caused, then what we may want to do is think about those kinds of causes that constitute excuses and those that don't. Given the evolutionary story, it looks as though the matter of moral responsibility really arises from the social need for civil behavior. That is, we need to have safety within the group. And when there is violation of safety through, for example, unprovoked aggression, something has to be done. If you have, and we see this actually in baboons and chimps and others, that if there is a member that is socially so problematic that they can't function, they're forced to leave. Or else, in some cases, they get so badly beaten up that they don't survive. So it looks like the idea, the basic ideas of moral responsibility and having a criminal justice system really are rooted in the need for social safety. We need to socialize children in proper sorts of ways. We need to protect ourselves. We need to also deter adults. Adults need to know that if they fail to do the appropriate thing, then there are consequences. The fourth thing I put in there, with kind of mixed feelings, because many people feel that revenge is something that no civilized person should feel or certainly act upon. And I just don't know what to think about it. It does seem to me that if you don't have a system whereby the aggrieved see the violator punished, that people simply will take justice into their own hands. It is just a social fact. And so you have to have some means to keep that particular lid on. I have no way of judging whether that is, as you might say, morally acceptable or morally unacceptable. I think it's just a fact about the way social animals work. So, given this fundamental platform of the need to punish the miscreants, it seems to me that the issue of exactly when we hold people responsible and when it's appropriate to punish can be kind of simply dealt with by three questions. We first of all want to know whether the guy really did it. We also want to know whether he can be treated. And third, we really want to know whether he will do it again. And a major part of why we distinguish between the voluntary and the involuntary is because it bears upon this prediction about whether the guy will do it again. So within the wider community, I think we have a prototype of voluntary action and a prototype of involuntary action. Parenthetically, I should just say that most of our concepts are organized as prototypes. That is, there is a kind of central example of whether it's a vegetable, or whether it's a mountain, or whether it's a hat. There is a kind of a central example, and then there are other examples that move out towards the periphery, and then at the boundary, there are instances where we don't really know whether to call something a hat or not. I mean, is a scarf really a hat? Well, who cares? Is parsley really a vegetable? Well, who cares? But everybody knows that a carrot is a vegetable. That is a prototypical vegetable. And that Everest is a prototypical mountain. Right? But is cavalry really a mountain? Well, it looks to me like a little hill, actually. But mostly it doesn't matter too much, although sometimes it does matter. In the case of whether an action is voluntary or not, I think we all operate with prototypes. And the voluntary prototype is robbing a bank or stealing a credit card. The prototype of the involuntary action is someone who is sleepwalking and, say, strangles his wife, which happens, or someone who is truly severely brain damaged, where we want to say, you know, they couldn't help it. They didn't really know what was going on. In between, I think there are many kinds of cases, and some of which we don't know whether to say they were voluntary or involuntary, strictly speaking, but where we mitigate. So, for example, the classic case of the husband who comes home and finds the wife in bed with the postman, and he hauls off and shoots the postman. In general, of course, we hold such a person, that is, we ask the question, did he do it? Of that, there is no doubt. But when we ask, will he do it again? Generally speaking, we're likely to say, probably not. Whereas, with something like the prototypical voluntary case, where the person robbed the bank, and we say, well, you know, if we let him go, is he likely to do it again? Or if we just give him a mild sentence, is he likely to do it again? The answer is, oh yeah, probably. I mean, that's what our experience informs us of. Now, I should also mention here, too, that in thinking about the metaphysical problem of whether or not we should ever hold people responsible if their actions were caused, as indeed all my speech must be right now, Owen Flanagan and his graduate student, Eddie Namias, did an interesting thing. They were interested in the question of whether or not this idea of acausality being attached to freedom is really kind of, you know, a philosophical hoked-up job, or whether that's actually how people think. And they found, as I did in an informal survey on the beach walking my dogs, that actually people don't think like that at all. It doesn't enter into their deliberations about whether or not the action was voluntary and whether the person should be held responsible, and if they should be held responsible, whether the sentence should be mitigated. It doesn't enter into it. It's a very, very interesting result. All right, so my prediction then is that with regard to the basics of the criminal justice system, did he do it? Can he be treated, and will he do it again? I think that's likely to remain very much as it is. There may be some places where there are sort of peripheral problematic instances where we're not really quite sure and where there may be no right answer. You and I may be on a jury where we're considering that an MAOA variant with an abusive upbringing beats people up nearly to death, and we're asked to do something. And you may feel that because, in a way that wasn't his choice to be an MAOA variant with an abusive upbringing, that he should be let go. But most of your jurors, is my experience, will disagree. They will say, I don't really care whether it was his fault to be an MAOA variant with an abusive upbringing. He's dangerous. If we let him out, he will do it again. That's the pattern. And that's part of the reason why I think that the basic framework, inadequate though it may be, is likely to remain the same. On the other hand, I think some other things might change that will bear upon matters of treatment and matters of prevention. Incidentally, I think one of the things that I should have had, one of the things I should have included on my list here is this recent discovery that there is a serotonin receptor gene. You know, there's about 21 different serotonin receptors. And for one of them, there is a variant, polymorphism, such that if you have that polymorphism and you do a lot of cannabis, you're likely to go nuts. You are very likely to become psychotic. That's an extraordinary discovery. And it's a discovery that every child and every teenager in high school should know, along with pictures about what it looks like to be psychotic. I think that there may well be treatments for certain kinds of addictions. There are already pharmacological interventions for alcoholism and for cocaine addiction, as well, of course, for that most addicting substance, nicotine. There may be things that we can do vis-a-vis the MAOA variants, and I know Ken Dodgson in the School of Public Policy and probably Caspian Moffat and others are thinking about these kinds of things. If I knew that I had a child who was an MAOA variant, then I might take very special precautions to ensure that that child wasn't stressed in such a way that they ended up being dysfunctional in the social domain. We need to know much more about serotonin and serotonin variants. We know that, as I said, that some of them, in the context of cannabis, are predisposed to have a psychotic break. But there are other issues that are involved with serotonin variants having to do with anxiety and stress and so forth. And there may be many more things that we can do with regard to early development to prevent some of the worst aspects of social dysfunction. Alcohol is in one way or another involved in the vast majority of violent crimes in this country. And, you know, it's not that, I mean, if you can bring it about that it's socially unacceptable to smoke, you should be able to bring it about that it's socially unacceptable to drink to excess. That seems to me that in a certain way, that's a problem that we know exists relative to serial killers. It's a massive problem, and it's something that we probably could do quite a lot about. So I'm just going to end with a slide about the brain and say what a great pleasure that it's been, and thank you for listening to me. I think I take questions, actually.